And welcome to today's webinar on the WaterFirst Program by GFA. We are glad that you're joining us, and we have a few folks who are still logging in, so we'll give them one more moment here. Please take a look at the instructions in the question chat area about what the webinar is about today, and feel free to drop in your questions throughout the webinar. So we'll be back with you in one moment. Okay, good morning again. Thanks again for joining us. We are glad to have you participate in today's webinar. This is the third in a series of 4 webinars on GFA's WaterFirst program. So we have one more coming up next week, and we have been posting recordings of the past webinars. So if you missed any of those, we'll show you how to find a link to the recording later on in today's webinar. So again, welcome. My name is Stacey Isaac Barraza. I'm with a consulting firm called IB Environmental, and we're helping GFA facilitate and sort of manage today's webinar. So thanks again for joining. We want to make this worth your time. So we'll just go through some quick logistics on the next slide about how to use the GoToWebinar platform. You all are probably pretty familiar with this at this point. This is your control panel, which you can toggle to make it smaller, minimize, or maximize it. We encourage you to use that box that you see at the bottom to put in questions for our speakers today. And we will also just kind of queue those up and probably save most of them for the end after Christine's presentation. But if it's more salient, we'll interrupt her and ask your question while she's presenting. There are several ways to engage in the webinar today or participate. So one is definitely to put your questions in. You all have taken some time out of your mornings today, so make it worth your time by asking the questions that have been on your mind or that you're curious about. The other way that you can participate is we'll have a few polls, I think 3 to be exact, and we ask that you take a moment to respond to those poll questions. So we can kind of gauge how things are going. And then there's going to be an evaluation at the end, a survey, letting us know what else you all want to know about WaterFirst and how things went today. And we'd really appreciate responses there, because like I said before, we have one more webinar in the series, and we will like to make adjustments. So that one's more effective and useful for you all. And then there is also a little feature with a hand icon. So you'll see like a palm. And that's called the raise hand feature. So if we come up with a question that we didn't think to put as an official poll question, we'll just ask that on the fly. So for instance, I'll say raise your hand if you're having any technical difficulties. Actually, let me change the question. I'll ask the opposite. Raise your hand if you're not having any technical difficulties. All right, so we'll look for the hands going up to make sure people can hear and everything. Again, you're raising your hand if you have no technical difficulties. All right, great. So we see some hands going up. On the next slide, we're going to just talk a little bit about the WaterFirst program at GFA. Again, the first webinar in the series really focused on an overview of the program. So if you feel like you need some basic sort of 101, WaterFirst 101, do go back and listen to the recording of that. And we'll be dropping some of those things into the chat as we go through here. So you'll have access to those links. I want to make sure to kind of going back to the GoToWebinar platform for a second, there are a couple of handouts that you'll see in your control panel. Go ahead and download those now during the webinar so you can follow along with Christine as she goes through her slides. So you have a PDF version of her slides. All right, so yes, about WaterFirst, let's just talk a little bit about an overview. So the WaterFirst program is administered by GFA, and it's a sort of a partnership with the local utilities and communities that your utilities are operating in and the state. It's supposed to go sort of above and beyond the state's minimum requirements. And so to kind of set up the webinar series here for you in a nutshell, we started off back in April, I believe, with a webinar that just kind of talked about WaterFirst pretty generally. We had some of the most recent WaterFirst designees, so communities who had recently gotten their designation came and talked about what was really challenging, what was easy, you know, just those kinds of, just from their experience, since it was so recent. The webinar last week was the presenters were the Georgia Waterwise Council, which is a group in the state of Georgia that kind of goes into more depth on water conservation. So that webinar was definitely going above and beyond the state's requirements. So what if you want to be an overachiever in terms of water conservation, and get some ideas on how you can build out your WaterFirst application or water conservation programs at your utility or community, that was the focus of last week. Today's presentation is going to look at the minimum environmental requirements by the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. So what's the basic that you have to be doing in the state of Georgia? And so that's what Christine is going to talk about. So that's just a kind of overview of the series. And next week, on the 17th, we have the last webinar in the series that we really think is going to be exciting, which is going to be a panelist of folks who evaluate the WaterFirst application. So there's a lot of paperwork that you have to put together. There are checklists, etc., on GFA's website to help you with your application. But I think that's going to be really informative because it's the folks who sort of review and evaluate that stuff who are going to come and speak to you in a couple weeks on the 17th. So if you haven't signed up for that one yet, here's a plug to go ahead and do that. So yeah, so this is the nutshell what the WaterFirst program is. It's going above and beyond the state's minimum requirements in terms of water, wastewater, and stormwater. So on the next slide, we have a little bit more information again about the application process. So what is involved with applying to be a WaterFirst designated communities? There are about 40 of these communities in the state of Georgia right now. A few were added just this year. It does not take 5 minutes to fill out the application, right? It's a process, but there's a lot of good help and resources at GFA to walk you through that process. So the next slide looks at one part of the application process involves an on-site review. So you have some say in what GFA staff and some of the evaluators come out and look at your utility. So you plan it, you show them, you know, the best or most interesting things that you have going on at your utility. But that's an important part of the application process that you should be thinking about as well from the beginning. So the next slide gives you sort of an overview of the components. So there are many parts of it, like I mentioned before: water, wastewater, stormwater. But within stormwater, we're looking at master planning. We are looking at educational outreach. So that could relate to water conservation, stormwater, you know, it just kind of runs the gamut. So it's meant to be pretty comprehensive, which is why the application won't take your community 5 minutes. So this gives you an overview of the components. And on the next slide, you'll see some of the benefits. So this one's going to be, we're going to kind of go a little bit out of order here, Alana. So the financial incentive is probably the most popular or well-known benefit, where GFA already has relatively low interest rates on their water loans. However, if you do achieve the WaterFirst designation, you qualify for a 1% even lower interest rate on GFA's water-related loans. So while it does take some time and definitely utility or community staff or resources to put together this application, that 1% interest rate reduction probably makes the business case for investing in seeking this designation, in my opinion. Of course, it depends on the size of loan that you're going to get, etc. If you'll go to the next slide, Alana, we'll come back to this one in a minute. So this was, I think, hot off the press. This was a tweet that I saw from GFA this morning. I'm not sure when it went out, but I noticed it this morning. I thought I would stick it in here. So one, if you're a fan of Twitter and you're not following at GFA Loan, you can see that handle there that maybe you want to start following, right? And so there were a number of communities that got loans from GFA recently, and 6 of them received this interest rate reduction because they have the WaterFirst designation. So I thought, throw that in there. That's not in your PDF handout if you're trying to follow along, because I put it in this morning. It just seemed hot off the press and salient. So if we go back to the previous slide, Alana. Yes, besides this big financial benefits of that interest rate reduction, there are other benefits. So for instance, there's a sign that you will see a picture of in a little bit. As you enter a community that has WaterFirst designation, you'll see these signs sometimes, or around the water utility, etc. Then there's access to special workshops and networking opportunities, and more of that may come in the future. That's something that GFA is considering building out right now. So yeah, EPD funding. So we have Christine who's going to talk about EPD, but not from the 319 grant funding perspective. But yeah, there is more about these benefits too in that first webinar that was back in April. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so these are the WaterFirst signs that I was telling you about. So there's basically a ceremony or a special meeting with your city council or your board of commissioners, whoever sort of are the leaders and the decision makers at your utility, where you will be presented with this sign as a public sort of introduction and welcoming into the GFA's WaterFirst program. Next slide.
Zizi, it's time
Okay.
for our speaker.
All right, great. So we are going to introduce now our speaker for today. Her name is Christine Bowdy. Christine graduated with a degree in geology from the University of West Georgia and has worked with the Georgia Environmental Protection Division, or EPD, for the past 19 years in the Watershed Protection branch. So she has a lot of experience, and she's actually, you know, besides her day job at the EPD, she actually has been pretty involved in the WaterFirst program for a number of years. So she's a great person to talk to today. And again, her presentation is going to focus more on the minimum requirements that you have to meet for the state, whereas WaterFirst is trying to get you to go a little bit above those requirements, right? So yeah, with that, we want to welcome Christine this morning. We can see you, Christine. We can see your slides. Take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming in to listen to the minimum environmental requirements for EPD. This have to do more with your permits. So let me make sure I can see my screen really well. So this has to do with essentially, if you hold permits with the state, I have been, as was mentioned, with the state for quite a while, since 2002. And I believe it was around 2003 or 4 that I started helping out with the WaterFirst program. This was way back when it was with the Department of Community Affairs. And they really wanted to make sure that, you know, the permits were, that the systems had, they were compliant with them. And if they needed a permit, they already knew that they needed that permit, and they had those as well. So I was kind of doing that environmental check for them for the WaterFirst program. Before I start getting into the specific permits, I think it's really helpful to kind of understand the layout of the Watershed Protection Branch. We have our primary permitting programs within the Watershed Protection Branch, so wastewater regulatory, drinking water, water supply, and non-point source. But we also have programs that kind of are sister programs. I will by default talk about the watershed compliance, because when I talk about permitting, you don't just get a permit and then you're good to go. You get a permit and then you got to comply with the requirements stated in those permits. But we also have internal programs that kind of support these regulatory programs. Obviously, regulatory support is pretty straightforward, but the Watershed Planning and Monitoring Program also does some modeling work that helps the permitting process for the wastewater regulatory program.
All right, everyone. So we are going to take our first poll, and you should see it on your screen now. The question is, when was the Georgia EPD established? And your options are 1927, 1972, 1916, or 1970. So if you would go ahead and click the radio button next to the year you believe that Georgia EPD was established and go ahead and submit your answer, we'll go ahead and look at the results once we are finished. So I see some responses coming in. Just gonna wait a few more seconds. Looks like more people are submitting. Right, and we will close this poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, Christine, looks like 78% voted for 1972 and 17% for 1970 and 6% for 1927.
Okay.
Would you like to give us all the answers?
Just for fun, 3 of these dates are significant. Yes, 1972 is when the Georgia EPD was established. 1970 was when the US EPA was established. And then my favorite, 1916 was when the first national park was started.
Awesome. All right, so a follow-up to the previous question. This is a bonus. Who was the governor at the time the Georgia EPD was established? Okay, so your options are Lester Maddox, Jimmy Carter, George Busby, or Sonny Perdue. So I see these votes are coming in a little quicker. Good job, guys. I see you caught on. Click those radio buttons next to the option that you believe is the correct answer for who was the governor at the time the Georgia EPD was established. Right? And giving you guys a few more seconds because I see some votes trickling in. And we will close this poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, 65% of you guys voted Jimmy Carter, 20% Lester Maddox, and 15% George Busby.
Jimmy Carter.
So, Jimmy Carter is correct. Good job.
Yeah, so we just want to have some little fun before we get into all the EPD stuff. So I'm going to start with the wastewater regulatory program. We have several different permit types that are issued out of this program. The most common is the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit. That essentially regulates any discharges to a water body directly. We also have our land application system permits, which obviously instead of discharging straight to a water body, they discharge to a land as opposed to directly. And it kind of soaks into the soil before it actually, becomes part of the groundwater system and completes that water cycle. We also have, and some of these systems, some of your systems may have this, there's the pretreatment, which is we regulate treated effluent discharge to a municipal POTW. So some of you may actually hold some of these permits for those pretreatment. And many of you may not necessarily have underground injection control permit, which is we also call UIC. But it warrants to note that it is a permit where we regulate the injection of fluids into the groundwater system. Most of our permits that are UIC have to do with groundwater remediation, but they also are for non-domestic septic tanks. Now, all of our wastewater permits, I'm going to give you kind of the general compliance that's necessary with our permits. One of the things I'm always going to note with all of them is revert back to your permit to see your specific requirements, because any and all the permits I'm going to talk about can, and a lot of times do, have special conditions specific to your system that you need to comply with. So almost all of the wastewater permits have effluent limitations and monitoring requirements. They have a sampling schedule. So it's not only certain constituents that you need to sample for, it's on a time frame of how frequently you need to sample. And then you have to report it back to EPD. So there may be, you may have to do quarterly sampling, but you only have to report once a year. Again, check your permits for your specific sampling and reporting requirements. And then again, those funky little site-specific special conditions that can be placed in your permits. Some of the most common wastewater parameters that are pretty much in all of your wastewater permits is BOD and TSS. So BOD is biological oxygen demand, TSS, total suspended solids, pH, fecal coliform, ammonia, and total phosphorus. There, of course, like I had mentioned, with the special conditions part, there may be additional parameters, and some of these parameters could be colors, metals, toxicity, temperature, things like that. Those are specific to the water body that's being discharged into, as well as the entity that is regulated. So if it's an industry that discharges hot water to a stream, it may change the temperature significantly enough of that stream that we need to put a parameter in there that they need to make sure that the temperature is at a certain point or below, so that it doesn't change the temperature enough to affect the biota in the stream. So we have two types of land application system permits. We have our traditional land application system. They have BOD and TSS limits of 50 and 90 milligrams per liter. They do not have fecal bacteria limits. They tend to be located in rural areas that actually restrict public access to them because of the lower limits that they don't have. And they tend to operate year-round. We also have reuse LASs. These have a lot more stringent BOD and TSS requirements. They actually have a fecal bacteria limit. They do allow public access, and they tend to be found in our urban areas. We also call these, by the way, our urban reuse land application system permits. And they tend to only operate during the summer months. So an urban reuse LAS could be on a golf course, or it could be like a ballpark or some kind of public park where people can have access on a regular basis, whereas the traditional LASs, they do not. Some of you actually may maintain general, I call these NPDES. It's easier for me to just say NPDES as opposed to NPDES. It's just a lot of effort there. So our general permits are essentially permits where one permit is issued and it's issued with many applicants. So a lot of entities are covered under one general permit. And again, that's another one where you have to go back and look at the requirements of these general permits that you fall under to make sure you comply with them. But some of the more common general permits that may or may not apply to your facility is the general NPDES permit GAG 6400 series. This essentially allows filter backwash discharges associated with water treatment activities. So if you have a water treatment plant, you very well may have one of these general permits. Now this one may be a little bit more infrequent, but the general NPDES permit GAG 8200 series, these allow discharges of biological and chemical pesticides into and adjacent to the waters of the state. So the two images below are a good indication of what, you know, these permits would apply to. So if it's mostly a DOT thing, but there are some cities and counties that may do this as well, and they would be required to have this general permit or comply with this general permit. So our drinking water permit program, so we have, you know, there are about 2,300 public water systems statewide. And public water systems serve about 89% of the state population. And what a public water system is it is a system that serves 15 or more connections or serve 25 or more people. So that's a pretty small system. There are components, just like with the wastewater permit, they all have, all of our permits for that matter, I'll be reiterating this as we go through the presentation, all of them have sampling requirements. And again, it's going to vary as well as that reporting requirements, because this is our water quality permit. So it's going to have constituents that you need to comply with, whether it's MCLs or action levels. And they're all going to have different sampling schedules and then times to report to EPD and or EPA. They actually also require drought and water conservation requirements. Now, because some of these systems can be pretty small, these requirements may be as simple as a checklist. so that the systems aren't too burdened because of their size to meet the requirements of the state. And those will need to be periodically updated. So it's not like you can develop these things one time and be like, put it on a shelf and go, check that box, I've done it. They will probably be required to be updated on a regular basis, at least once every 10 years, I would suspect. And just like the wastewater permit, there are special conditions that may be placed in your permit that are specific to your system or in the area that you're located. For example, in North Georgia, we got the new issue with PFOA and PFAS. So there may be some requirements placed in your permit that make you have to comply with, the fact that you're located in an area that could have those constituents. Same thing with areas that have radon. So there just may be additional requirements. And again, you got to revert and look back to your actual issued permit to make sure that you're complying with that. And all of these permits, they have different dates that they expire. Like the wastewater permits tend to be 5-year permits. Then we have our drinking water permit. This is a 10-year permit. So you may have multiple permits that you maintain with this EPD, but they may not all expire at the same time to make it convenient for you to go, oh, wait, all my permits are expired, so I need to go and renew them. You just need to be able to keep track of each permit that you maintain with the state and renew them, as well as complying with the different constituents and things that you need to analyze for with each permit. In addition to some of those other requirements of the permit as it's issued, because they're water quality focused, there's some preliminary requirements to get a drinking water permit, and those tend to be our source water assessment plans or wellhead protection plans. It just depends on whether you have a surface water source or a groundwater source. For the surface water assessment plans, they apply to our surface water sources and also groundwater under the direct influence of surface water. So we call those our greedy sites. And wellhead protection plans, they apply to our specifically groundwater wells that have a confining layer. And one of the ways, the easiest ways to determine if your well is a greedy or, just a standard groundwater well is to do a test. If you find surface water bugs in your well water, you're probably a greedy site. So, and that's all required prior to you actually getting your source, whether it's a surface water source or your well, added to your permit. And essentially what these boil down to is that it looks at nearby sources of pollution, and these determine whether any additional water quality requirements will need to be added to your permit to make sure that it's protecting human health. So that's the reason why those are required prior to the permit being issued, because the permit may have to be modified to address those constituents that were found in these assessment plans. And again, part of the actual drinking water permit, you need to submit monthly operating reports. Again, this is a water quality focused permit. So these spreadsheets have actually daily withdrawals from your source, whether it's surface water or groundwater, but it also has what you did to disinfect it. So this one focuses actually, it gets both of those pieces of information, but focuses a little bit more on the water quality aspect of complying with the permit. There's also contaminant rules that you need to make sure that you're complying with. And again, these all have their own sampling schedules as defined by EPA. So, and these are just some of the major ones. So coliform, lead and copper, radionuclides, nitrates, organic and inorganic chemicals. There's a whole lot of constituents and also disinfectant byproducts. In addition to all of these requirements for contaminant monitoring, there's annual consumer confidence reports that are required as part of your drinking water permit. And these essentially say, you send this in, you send out a kind of a summary of the water quality that your public has received over the course of a year. And then you also provide a copy to EPD to show that you actually sent this out to your customer base to let them know what their water quality was. There are also some other kind of non-scheduled reporting requirements as bad things occur. So if you have a system upset of some kind that requires you to do a boil advisory out to your customers, EPD has to be notified of that, as well as there's a complaint hotline. So you got to send in significant complaints that you've received about your water treatment plant or by your customers, so that EPD is aware of these things. So these are not necessarily regular, they're as they come in, and those are requirements to be submitted to EPD. So our water supply program is our water quantity permits. We have actually 3 major kinds. Ag, I'm not going to cover because I can't imagine anybody who has an agricultural water field is going to want a WaterFirst designation. But we do have our non-farm related permits, and one of those is surface water withdrawal. So the requirement for this is if an entity withdraws 100,000 gallons or more on a monthly average basis, then they're required to have a permit. You would think groundwater is the same, but it's not. Groundwater's requirement is if you withdraw 100,000 gallons or more in a day, you are required to have a permit. So that means that all the other days of the year, you don't withdraw 100,000 gallons, you're still, but one day you do, you're required to have a groundwater withdrawal permit. So that's it's a significant difference between the 2 permits, because a lot of people assume, well, they read the surface water requirement and they're like, oh, it's a monthly average basis, I don't need a groundwater permit because I have groundwater wells. Well, that's not the case, and the rules state otherwise. We also have our 401 water quality certifications, and this essentially has to do with, these are required for when there's construction activities going on and those result in any change of dredged or fill material getting into the waters of the US. And essentially these certificates are issued so that it verifies the compliance with the existing water quality requirements for that water body. So each water body has a designated use, and each designated use has water quality requirements associated with each, and they vary. So if it's navigation, then it may not be as stringent as a drinking water designation for a water body. So it just varies, but the 401 certification verifies that there's compliance with the existing water quality requirements for that designation of that water body. And just a little image over here is our river basins. We have 14 river basins in the state of Georgia, and that's those. So you can see, they're quite vast and very important to the state. And of course, the little image just below the words is a karst area. So in many cases, if you place a well and it's a more shallow well, you're going to end up being a GWIDI site, which would be groundwater under the direct influence of surface water. So these requirements for our water quantity permits tend to be a little more robust compared to the drinking water permit requirements. Again, that's a water quality permit. This is a water quantity permit, but these tend to be our larger users. When we have that 100,000 gallons per day threshold, that's a pretty large user compared to a system that serves 15 connections. So they have to actually develop a drought response plan. So not just like a questionnaire that we had for the drinking water program, but an actual full-blown plan. And they need to comply with our drought rule. So they have to be aware of the rules that apply to the development of that plan to make sure they're not in conflict. And these plans, again, need to be updated at least every 10 years. These are 10-year permits. So you can't just develop it one time and go put it on a shelf and go, check box, I did that. Because when we updated our rules, if you had an old plan that's older than those rules, then you could possibly be out of compliance with your drought response plan, because it could be contrary to the drought rule. And just like the drinking water and the wastewater permits, there are monitoring requirements. Just like drinking water, there's monthly reports of withdrawal. So we focus on the quantity of withdrawal as opposed to a quality aspect, which is covered under the drinking water. And we also have facility specific requirements. Here we want to know purchase sales. It doesn't apply to every system, but some systems purchase water and some systems sell, and some do both. And we need to know that information so we can kind of see how the water is distributed throughout the state. It especially has importance with innovation transfer information. These systems all have to comply with regional water planning. That's if you're outside the metro district, and then you have to comply with the metro district compliance if you're inside the metro district. And that essentially means these plans are updated every 5 years, and they're in the process of actually updating these plans right now as we speak, and they should be finished by 2022, the end of 2022. So if you have a water conservation plan that goes, oh, I know I have to comply with the Lower Flint-Ochlockonee region. Well, guess what? By the end of 2022, your water conservation plan may not be compliant with it any longer because you will have new management practices outlined in that plan. So that will be a good time to revisit your water conservation plan and your drought response plan, because it could have some drought response management practices outlined in those regional water plans that you need to comply with. So I would honestly say your water conservation plan needs to be updated every 5 years, consistent with when the regional water plans are updated, because you could possibly be out of compliance with them. And the state cannot process any permit application requests unless you're complying with the management practices that apply to you from these regional water plans. Again, for systems that serve a population of 3,300 or more, you also have to do an annual water loss audit. So that's free AWWA software. March 1st every year, you have to submit this water loss audit to us. And as a part of that, all systems have to develop water loss control programs as a part of this rule. And that essentially takes a look at the recommendations in your water audits that you receive, and developing a plan to improve your water efficiency, because another requirement as part of this whole issuance of this rule is continued water efficiency. So EPD takes these water loss audits, and we have a summary of all of them, and we look at that particular system when they come in for a renewal or for modification of some kind, and we look at their past water audits through time since 2011 to make sure that they're making progress towards becoming more efficient. Now, you know, again, this information is available on the EPD website, but we also know that sometimes when you get better data, your validity scores go down. So, you know, don't panic. Like, if you can view your history from the water audits that you submitted to, and if this applies to you, do understand that EPD knows that sometimes better data gives a better picture, and sometimes a better picture is a more realistic image, which isn't necessarily as rosy as it may have been when you were making assumptions. So we don't necessarily like to beat our systems up, but we do want to make sure that they're making an effort through development of their water loss control programs to be more efficient through time. And lastly, we have our non-point source program. I thought this image was great because it essentially shows both point source and non-point source, and non-point source is everything that isn't point source. So, you know, that's the importance of this for the non-point source program. And for the non-point source program, we have two types of permits: municipal separate storm sewer system, or MS4 permits. And those include phase 1 large and medium systems that serve populations between, you know, greater than 100,000, and then large are greater than 250,000. And the phase 2 small systems, and you are essentially a small system if you're an MS4 that's not covered under the phase 1. It's based on the US Census Bureau's definition of urbanized area, and this includes non-traditional MS4s such as public universities, prisons, hospitals, those kind of things. So, you know, it's smaller systems than we would have thought, but those do have to have and comply with the phase 2 small systems. We also have our erosion and sedimentation permit, and these are essentially permits that are associated with construction activities. And that's essentially making sure that, you know, folks are putting the right measures in place to minimize the total suspended solids that can get to a stream, which is just more protective of water quality, the biota there, and keeping soil stabilized, and also flood protection. So, excuse me, our MS4s have some programs and plans that need to be submitted as part of complying with these permits. And again, your permits state what your requirements are. So always look back at your permit to make sure you're complying with those deadlines that are outlined in those plans. and those permits to make sure that you stay compliant. So you got to be looking at these things. They got to become your best friends. You got to look at them all the time and make sure that you're staying on top of things. First and foremost is the development of a stormwater management program, or SWAMP. And these are plans that you submit to EPD that do get EPD approval. So you shouldn't receive a SWAMP and have a SWAMP on unless it's been approved by EPD. And these include things like making sure you're listing your best management practices, you're identifying highly visible sources of pollution, you're addressing how you would handle illicit discharge detection elimination, construction site management, those kind of things, so that you're minimizing the impacts of stormwater onto your water bodies that are nearby. There's also an enforcement response plan, and that essentially describes any actions to be taken for violators associated with illicit discharge, those highly visible pollutant sources, or anybody who's just not taking measures to minimize non-point source pollution running off of their sites if there's construction or what have you. There's also a requirement for an impaired waters plan. And this essentially is a plan that identifies impaired waters that end up on the 305B or 303D list plan. And you identify those waters that are on those lists or in those lists, which contain MS4 outfalls within the system's jurisdiction. You also have to identify those pollutants of concern that are impairing those water bodies, and then come up with a plan of how to address each pollutant of concern that's impairing those water bodies within the jurisdiction. There's also, lastly, an annual report that's required for the MS4, and that essentially includes all monitoring data collected for the reporting year, the reporting period, assessment of the effectiveness of your BMPs that you employed over the year, assessment of the data trends and pollutants of concern for those impaired water bodies. And then, there's additional requirements, and these are just naming a few of those, but you also have to complete forms for dry weather screening, inspection, maintenance, revisions of your swamp, those kind of things. So it covers a lot of information. And again, all of the requirements are covered through the permit, so you know exactly what is expected of you. We have a trivia question.
Yes, so the poll question is up on everyone's screen. And this question is, which of the following permits are federally regulated? And now this option, you can check all that apply. So go ahead and click the box next to each answer that you think is related to this question. The options are wastewater discharge permits, water withdrawal permits, drinking water permits, or stormwater permits. So again, check all that apply. Great. And answers are rolling in. Thank you guys for going ahead and submitting those responses and paying attention. We'll give it a few more seconds so others can get those responses in. All right, and we will go ahead and close that poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, Christine, so it looks like 100% of people have voted for the wastewater discharge permits, 89% voted for stormwater permits, and then 79% at both water withdrawal permits and drinking water permits.
So of these four, the only non-federally regulated permit is water withdrawal permits. That is 100% state regulated. Everything else is federally regulated. So a little bit interesting trivia for you. And that essentially is the minimum requirements for complying with EPD permits. But what we really want to see when we think about a WaterFirst, I think it was well said just as we started this webinar, is going beyond our requirements. We want to see systems really taking, and it doesn't have to be the whole gamut. Like some people have a non-point source program that is very robust and above and beyond. Now, while we would like it to be everything, but we understand that, you know, typically it's the money issue that we run into. So, you know, just making sure that you go beyond where your regulation ends is what we want to see.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Christine, for that really comprehensive overview. I mean, we're talking so many different permits. That was a lot of good information. We do have some questions. So folks asked about links and where they can find recordings and registration for the next webinar, etc. So we don't expect you to answer them and read out a URL. We responded to those and shared it with everybody. One question we have is EPD planning to change the water audit requirements soon. You kind of addressed that a little bit, Christine, that, you know, plans get updated, but can you say a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, so they may be asking more with regard to the change from the version 5 to the version 6 water audit software, which is now out there and available. We are holding classes where people can get certified in V6. But we do understand we're limited on how many classes we can hold between now and March 1st. So as of next year, we're accepting both V5 and V6 water audits, and we will do that until such time as we can make sure that everybody who is a koala or certified water loss auditor can actually get that V6 training so that they can submit that information. So we're not going to, you know, require just V6 come March 1st, and most people don't even have access to get the class. That would just be unfair. So we're going to, for a while, we're going to accept both V5 and V6 until we can make sure that everybody gets that appropriate training. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, I hope so too. And if you have a link, Christine, you can send it right now, or we can do it after, about where to get some of this training. You know, that probably will help folks keep up to date with, you know, the latest trainings, etc. Okay.
Yeah, I may have to send that to you later if that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly tech savvy, so I want to make sure I send it and then you can distribute it out to folks, but yeah, I don't want to like try to search right now.
I hear you. Okay, and maybe we will include it in the follow-up email or something that comes after this webinar, right? Okay, so this one's a little bit long, and basically the question here is your thoughts on this sort of statement, right? Groundwater withdrawal permits level out so many wells. Okay, there are many urban farms, businesses, individuals that have wells that are not tracked in the Atlanta metro area. So I guess this is specific to the urban metro Atlanta area. During recent droughts, many of the urban farm wells were going dry. A lower daily withdrawal amount should probably be added to EPD's requirements. And if you have any thoughts on that, it may be above your pay grade, but yeah, if you have any thoughts on that to share, that would be great.
So we regulate 100,000 gallons or more per day. Mm-hmm. It would take a law change to reduce that and regulate that. I don't think that threshold has any inkling of changing anytime soon, but I do know residential wells tend to be the ones that suffer during drought. They're more shallow wells. Especially in the Metro District, though, anything north of the fall line, the groundwater is typically found in fractures. There's not a lot of regoliths, so it doesn't have the storage potential it does south of the fall line in Georgia. So that is regulated by the county health departments. But again, the groundwater, especially in the metro area, is it's fractures, and it tends to be less used and as a backup. But I do know an individual homeowner, they're going to have to contact the county health departments for any kind of help with regard to that. It is below our regulatory threshold, and we really I don't see that the law is going to change anytime soon to make it where EPD regulates something more stringent than 100,000 gallons or more. We've had discussions about it, but it just didn't really go anywhere.
Got it. Okay, thank you. And before I look at the next question here, I'll ask Alana to start sharing the closeout slides. There's a placeholder for questions that would be good. All right, great. Let's see, what other questions do we have here, Christine? Okay, actually, I don't see any more right now. So I wanted to just kind of pose my question to you. There was a lot of information that you gave, and you had to cover all these different types of water, if you will. So there's a concept of one water, but the way permitting, et cetera, is done, it's kind of, you know, differentiated between the different types of water. It's siloed, yes. I try not to use that word, but you're right. That is the word that comes to mind. What's your parting thought here? If people leave the webinar with sort of one sort of, you know, maybe really salient or overarching theme, what would you say you want them to take away from this?
So you're right. There are a lot of requirements that individuals have to comply with, especially municipal water systems. If they have any questions, there are a few of us in EPD, such as myself, that kind of go branch wide. I've had to, because of the WaterFirst program, become very familiar with the other programs and what their requirements are to kind of help people and actually know the compliance of whether they were compliant before I did my WaterFirst review for someone who's applying for a WaterFirst designation. So if when everything else fails and you can't find information on the EPD website, if it's specific to a program and you know that program that you need to have that question addressed for, by all means, reach out to the program. And typically, you can start with a manager. You know, the manager information is available on the EPD website. But if you have like a general question and it could slop over to a few programs, a lot of people tend to get frustrated because they get passed around. Reach out to me. I will be able to find the answer for you. One thing I did not mention during this presentation is that if you have a wastewater treatment plant, you probably are running into biosolids disposal issues. Right. That's a land branch. So that's not even the watershed protection branch. It's a land branch regulation. So again, you can reach out to me. I can kind of be the one who does all the sleuth work for you and tries to get you the answer, because I do know a lot of people, it's a big organization. There's a lot of players and a lot of them are very focused on their specific responsibilities within the state. And then people call thinking EPD is EPD, right? EPD, everybody in EPD knows everything about EPD. And that's not really the case. So just have patience, reach out to me if you need to. I'll find the answer for you.
Well, that is a very generous offer, Christine. So, and of course, then we get, well, what's her contact information again? So we drop that in the chat, or the chat as well, the question area. And a reminder that Christine's contact information is also in the PDF handout. So a plug, if you joined late, go ahead and download the handout that has her slides, which will contain her contact information. But if you need it right away, we dropped it in the chat. And then, of course, we have a couple more minutes here, Christine, so if you would oblige,
sure.
There's another question. Can a utility that does not have responsibility for stormwater management become a WaterFirst utility? And that might be more for GFA in general, but Christine, did you have anything to add on that? So let me repeat the question. Can a utility that does not have responsibility for stormwater management become a WaterFirst utility?
We do know that there are systems that sometimes through their HB 849 service delivery agreement, which essentially outlines who does what, where, and what in the county, they can actually say, if they agreed, you know, the city lets the county handle the stormwater stuff, or vice versa. The county lets the city handle stormwater stuff. That's perfectly normal. It's perfectly fine. And I do not think, and again, you guys can answer the WaterFirst designation, but I don't think that that's a tick against you, because that's something that you've agreed to in a phase of, okay, these guys handle that for us. And that's fine. Like I said, I would think that my expectation is, as long as you're doing something above and beyond the regulations in a particular area. So if you don't necessarily do stormwater, maybe you're going, you know, really well with your setbacks that you can have established for your own city, or within the county, you have additional setbacks that besides the state setback of 25 feet, say. You just do something that is kind of what help protect NonPoint, you know, discharges to a stream body, but you aren't the necessarily owner of it. So you just get whoever kind of manages that there to establish an ordinance or something that can help you kind of say, look, we increased the buffer within our jurisdiction, and you know, this is keeping our streams even more pristine because there's less impact from construction activities or things like that. We keep the conditions more natural around that stream body. So I would think that that would be something that would be okay. It's acceptable that, you know, you don't necessarily have to manage all these various things.
Great, thanks. Amanda, did you want to add something from GFIS perspective here?
I did, and I will say I have just kind of become kind of point with the WaterFirst. Christine's been doing this way longer than me, but something I've observed and could be a potential for other communities. Don't let being a small community deter you from coming in and applying. And I'm not sure if this was talked about before, and I apologize if it was for the previous. I was out of town for the first webinar. It can be a collaborative effort. For instance, Newton County, along with all the cities within Newton County, it's a whole collaborative effort. So not only is Newton County WaterFirst, but all of the communities within Newton County is WaterFirst. They apply together as an agreement between all the cities and the county. So don't let a small community, you know, if you don't have a sewer program or a water system or something like that, it can be a collaborative effort for the city and the county, which is amazing and awesome if a whole county and all the cities within it was WaterFirst designated, going above and beyond, you know, the basic parameters that are out there. So that's all I wanted to put out there. Was it can be a collaborative effort, and feel free to reach out to us, Christine, anyone, to get more information on that, or if we can get you contacts with some of these WaterFirst designated communities.
Yeah, I will tell you though too, for me, I love it when there's collaborative working together. We don't see that often enough, and if there is, to me, that's bonus points.
Okay, great. So we're gonna wrap up here. I wanted to just share, well, one quick question. I think this is more for Christine. It's a big question, so say what you can. What about emerging contaminants? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, like the PFOA and PFAS. Well, the state essentially, because water quality is more an EPA-driven permitting process, we have to wait for EPA to make a decision. Like they have action levels right now for PFOA and PFAS. However, what we do as EPD is we do studies. So currently right now we're doing a study of all of the systems up in North Georgia that can be impacted by PFOA and PFAS, so that we can give information to EPA to say, here's what we're looking at. And then that helps them kind of speed their process along of whether they determine there's an MCL for this, or they keep it action levels, what have you. So we work with them as best we can, knowing that EPA is the driver of those emergent contaminants, and they're the ones who are going to really ultimately determine if MCLs are set, what those MCLs are, or if they're going to leave it at action levels based off of, you know, how you know, like these, I know PFOA and PFAS are legacy constituents, so they stay in the body all the time, and they don't go away. They're in the environment and they'll be there forever, in perpetuity. So it just depends, I guess, on the constituent. We tackle it as we can to be most protective that we can be for human health, especially with regard to our drinking water, but we have to work with EPA, who is really the one who drives what the levels will be.
Excellent. Yeah. So it's kind of a wait and see. I did add one little link to a blog post that we addressed some of this, right? Like, how do you, contaminants are going to be regulated in the future. We don't know always which ones and what threshold, the maximum containment levels or MCLs, as you said, Christine, but there are like sort of financial managerial steps that maybe utilities can take to get ready for that. And of course, we can't leave this webinar with saying we are in an unprecedented time with the infrastructure bill being passed, and so there is going to be some funding if utilities want to get ahead of the game and start tackling some of this. But well, Christine, thank you again so much for addressing these questions. As I was saying, this is the last question, then that would give folks time to drop in another one. So you've been very generous with your time and your offer to be like sort of the point of contact and sort of funnel people's questions and concerns throughout EPD. That is a very valuable offer, folks, trust me. So the next slide just mentions the next WaterFirst series. Well, the webinar in this series. So we have the last one coming up on the 17th, and that's how you can go ahead and register for that. And you should have a link early on in this event today that shows you how to register for that. I think we lost the screen there for a second, but and then the next slide is just how to contact GFA's Water Resources Division. So yeah, if we just hit the next slide there, we're on it. So you'll see not necessarily a specific contact within GFA, but the Water Resources Division. This is how you can contact them, through this sort of generic email address. But thank you all so much for your engagement today and your good questions. And we hope to see you on the 17th. It's a free webinar, so please tell your friends and your colleagues who might be interested in this topic to attend that one. Take a moment, please, to fill out the evaluation that's going to be coming up on your screen here in a second. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks again for joining us. So we'll go ahead and stop the broadcast now and close out the webinar.